The morning fog hung thick in the air when Detective Adrian Keats arrived at the old Victorian house. The street was quiet, too quiet, as if even the city itself held its breath in anticipation. Keats had been on the force for 15 years, but there was something about this case that felt different, something that clawed at the edges of his instincts. He had learned enough to trust his gut when it whispered to him. The victim, Mark Hendricks, was found sprawled in the study, a half-filled glass of whiskey beside him, its amber liquid now spilled across the Persian rug. He was the husband of Claire's cousin, a detail that twisted the tragedy into a knot of secrets no one was eager to unravel. Claire Morgan was a petite, elegant woman, her composed exterior masking a turbulent world beneath. She was the wife of a well-respected businessman, Charles Morgan, known for his charm and influence. Their marriage, at first glance, seemed idyllic, but as Keats would soon discover, beneath that veneer lay a tangle of betrayal, deceit, and unquenched desires. The affair between Claire and Mark had begun almost innocuously. Family gatherings, holiday dinners, they shared laughter, secret glances, a forbidden touch here and there. At first it was a game, a way to inject excitement into their routine lives. But the thrill of their secret meetings quickly grew into something far darker. Mark's attentions were possessive, his passion consuming, and soon he was pressing her to leave her husband, to be with him entirely. Claire hesitated. She adored the thrill, but she did not want to shatter her life or her family. As Keats pieced together the affair, he began to suspect that the killing might not have been a crime of passion as it initially seemed. There were signs of struggle. An overturned chair, a single scuff mark on the floor where it shouldn't be. The autopsy report revealed traces of a powerful sedative in Mark's system. Claire hadn't just come to confront him. She had come prepared. The realization hit Keats like a cold wave. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment act. It was premeditated. Witnesses, neighbors, and passers-by recalled seeing Claire arrive at Mark's home that evening, her face pale, her expression determined. No one thought much of it. After all, they were family. But Keats had reviewed the surveillance footage. He watched as Claire slipped into the house, her silhouette tense and purposeful. Under questioning, Claire's stoic mask began to crack. She admitted to the affair but insisted that she had loved Mark deeply, that the sedative had been intended only to calm him down, as he was threatening to reveal their affair to her husband. She claimed that things had escalated when he drank the whiskey, his emotions spiraling out of control. He had cornered her, accusing her of using him. In a moment of desperation, she had lashed out, shoving him hard enough to send him crashing to the floor, where he struck his head on the corner of the desk. But Keats was not convinced by her story. He had seen her type before. Smart, calculating, always a step ahead. There was something too convenient about her confession, the way she clung to the idea of self-defense. As the investigation deepened, Keats uncovered a chilling twist. The cousin, Mark's wife, had known about the affair all along. She had even confronted Claire on multiple occasions, warning her to stay away, to stop toying with her husband. But Claire's defiance had only stoked the flames. Mark's wife, it seemed, had been complicit, a pawn in Claire's twisted game. In the end, the pieces fell into place with a brutal clarity. Claire had orchestrated everything, right down to the final confrontation. She had lured Mark with promises of a future, played on his obsession, and manipulated him until he was no longer in control. And then, when he had served his purpose, she silenced him. Claire Morgan was arrested that cold autumn evening, her face as pale and composed as ever. As Keats watched her being led away, he couldn't help but feel a sliver of respect for her cunning. She had come within a hair's breadth of getting away with it, her web of lies woven so tightly that even the smallest thread had been nearly impossible to pull loose. Yet, in the end, it was her own arrogance, her unwavering belief in her power over others, that had undone her. Claire sat in the sterile confines of the interrogation room, her wrists bound, yet her expression as calm as a lake on a still night. Detective Keats entered with a quiet resolve. He had the evidence he needed, but he was still searching for that one final detail, that last piece that would solidify her guilt beyond doubt. He knew that if Claire's plan had been this elaborate, she likely had a backup, a contingency, something he hadn't yet seen. "Mrs. Morgan," he began, taking a seat across from her, "I think you're a clever woman, but everyone leaves a trace, even you." She lifted her gaze, a faint smirk dancing on her lips. "Detective Keats, I'm sure you have your theories, but you don't have everything. I know the law. Self-defense isn't murder." Keats leaned in, close enough to catch a glimmer of satisfaction in her eyes. She was daring him, tempting him to try to unravel her story. It was then he realized she still believed she had control over him, over this entire case. He pulled out a small envelope, setting it on the table between them. She looked at it, her brow furrowing ever so slightly. "Do you recognize this?" Keats asked, his voice steady. He carefully slid out a photo of a handwritten note, the ink smeared in places, but the words clear. "You promised you'd leave him. It's tonight, or I tell Charles everything." For the first time, Claire's mask slipped. Her eyes widened as she recognized the note she had once scribbled to Mark in a fit of frustration. She hadn't anticipated that he would keep it, let alone that it would be used as evidence against her. Keats continued, his tone softer now, as if speaking to a friend. "You see, Mark kept everything, Claire. Texts, letters, little pieces of your affair. Every message where you hinted at him threatening your marriage. You wanted it all, didn't you? The thrill, the passion, without the consequences. You used him, and when he became a liability, you silenced him." She shook her head, regaining composure. "No one will believe that note proves anything. Mark was unstable. He threatened my life that night, detective. I was protecting myself." Keats sighed, as if disappointed. "You're right, one note isn't proof of premeditated murder, but the surveillance footage tells a different story." He took out a USB drive and inserted it into a small monitor in the room. The screen flickered to life, showing grainy but unmistakable footage of Claire slipping something into Mark's whiskey before he took a drink. She watched herself on the screen, her face going pale as she realized she'd left a piece of evidence that would unravel her entire defense. "You sedated him," Keats stated. "If it was self-defense, why drug him first? Why ensure he'd be too weak to fight back?" Her silence was her answer. He continued, voice cold and unyielding now. "You planned this, Claire. You knew he'd become a threat to your marriage, that he'd ruin the life you'd worked so hard to construct. So you sedated him, confronted him while he was barely conscious, and then finished what you'd started." She sat back, her face void of emotion now, the realization sinking in that her carefully constructed alibi had shattered. She looked at Keats, a strange smile appearing on her lips. "Detective," she said slowly, "it's fascinating, isn't it? How one mistake can bring down an empire." Keats raised an eyebrow. "Empires built on deception always crumble, Claire." She laughed softly, almost bitterly. "You wouldn't understand. Mark wasn't just some fling. He was a chance at something more." Her gaze hardened. "But he was also reckless, weak. He didn't deserve it in the end." Keats couldn't suppress a shiver at her words. This wasn't about love or betrayal anymore. This was a woman who believed in her own supremacy, someone who saw people as tools to be used and discarded. "You're going away for a long time, Claire," he told her, standing up. "No wealth, no status, no twisted game will change that." As he left the room, Keats felt the weight of justice settle heavily on his shoulders. He had seen cold-hearted killers before, but Claire was different. A chilling reminder of what obsession and entitlement could drive a person to do. For Claire, the cost of her empire was clear now. Her freedom, her reputation, her life as she knew it. And for Keats, he knew that as long as people like Claire existed, he would be there, piecing together the darkness they tried to hide. In the days following Claire Morgan's arrest, the city buzzed with whispers and speculation. News outlets painted her as a femme fatale, a cunning woman whose ambition and vanity had led to her downfall. But in the dark, shadowy world of criminal justice, it was Detective Keats who would carry the story's weight, feeling its cold chill long after the case faded from public memory. The trial was swift. With the mountain of evidence, Mark's kept letters, the surveillance footage, the sedative found in his system, Claire's defense crumbled. Her attorneys argued for manslaughter, insisting it was a crime of passion, an accident. But the prosecution was unyielding, painting a picture of a calculated killer, a woman whose obsession with control had finally pushed her too far. The jury returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. First-degree murder, premeditated and ruthless. As she listened to the verdict, Claire's face remained impassive, but a flicker of something, a cold rage perhaps, glimmered in her eyes. She didn't plead for mercy, didn't utter a word. Her silence was as chilling as her crime, and in that quiet courtroom, she was led away in handcuffs, her composure unbroken. After the trial, Keats returned to his usual duties, but Claire's case lingered in his mind like a shadow. He found himself haunted by her last words to him in that interrogation room. "Detective, it's fascinating, isn't it? How one mistake can bring down an empire." But it wasn't one mistake, Keats knew. It was a life of callous decisions, a web of manipulation, and the insatiable hunger for control that had finally ensnared her. He had met criminals of all kinds, but Claire was different. Her crime was not born of desperation, poverty, or impulse. Hers was the crime of a woman who believed she was above consequence, above justice. Months passed, and as the city moved on, Claire's name was forgotten by most. Just another headline, lost in time. Keats, however, kept a small memento from the case, a copy of that fateful note Mark had saved. Sometimes he'd pull it out, reading the words she had once written in a fit of passion and arrogance. It was a reminder of the thin line between love and obsession, between desire and destruction. In the end, he realized, Claire hadn't just killed a man. She'd destroyed herself, burning her own empire to the ground, her own life reduced to ashes. And in the cold steel walls of her prison cell, Claire would have plenty of time to reflect on the twisted game she'd played and lost. And for Keats, there was a final satisfaction, a quiet assurance that justice, however brutal and delayed, had found its way into even the darkest corners of the human heart.